Okay, let's start. If you want to speak, you will have to unmute yourself. But this is Ask Larry. So what questions do you have today? Anyone have a question you want to talk about? Don't be bashful. Okay, there's one or two things that have come up during the week that I want to talk about then.
Good morning.
Good morning. You have a question? Or you're just saying good morning? Okay, well, maybe some discussion would bring some questions forward. One of the things that keep popping up, we only need 2 or 3 more days. The other side doesn't want to give it to us because the lender's not ready to go. You have to remember, we have paragraph 35 in our sales contract, and it's a killer. So you really need to make sure you go over with the buyer and the lender right up front. That paragraph 35 in your sales contract, called time is of the essence, okay, means that the dates and timeframes agreed to by the parties must be met, okay? They must be met, all right? Failure to meet those stated dates or timeframes will result in a waiver of contractual rights or will be a default under the terms of the contract. So at midnight on the day of settlement, if your party cannot settle, okay, for any reason, they are in default, whether it's the lender's fault or not, they're going to be in default, okay? And they're lose their contractual rights because we no longer have a contract after midnight. So the other side doesn't have to give an extension. Quite frankly, if I was the other side and you needed more days and I was going to grant it, I would ask for some kind of remuneration. Okay, I would definitely ask for some kind of remuneration. So much per day. I'm not sure that I would try to go after a penalty because penalties aren't allowed in the state of Virginia for a contract, but I would probably ask for my per diem and other costs that I am going to incur to give the extension. And I want that money up front, not part of the settlement. So I've seen people also say that the deposit will be forfeited. Okay. Okay, so whoever's car that, you might want to mute your camera. I'm looking at. All right, I think you got it.
Thank you.
We have this problem quite often, and I just would not be so upset when I get a call saying your contract's going to be void as of settlement. Give yourself enough time to solve the situation. Okay. Any questions about that paragraph? Because it comes up every day. Every day we have someone saying, well, why won't they just give us the extension? Okay. They don't have to. Okay. They do not have to. Okay. Any questions about time is of the essence? And you know, Virginia, the VAR contract doesn't have time is of the essence. So if someone were to bring you a contract written on the Virginia Association of Realtor contract form, if they miss settlement date, they still have some time to get to the table, you know? So their contract's more like, we'll get there, don't worry about it. But we're in Northern Virginia, very litigious society up here in time is of the essence as part of our contract. If there's no questions about that or other questions, then I want to talk about today the Virginia disclosure law, what happened to it as of 2020, July 1st. There were some additions, some subtractions, etc. So I just want to go through the statute a little bit for what's covered, what's not covered, and our duties. Okay? So what properties are actually covered by paragraph 7 of your sales contract, the Property Disclosure Act. Okay. If it's a sale, an exchange, an installment sale, which means the owner's holding the mortgage or a lease with the option to purchase, all those properties are covered. If it's a 1 to 4 dwelling unit property, so 1 to 4 dwelling units, it does not apply to all transactions. You can get a complete list of the exemptions in the act, but some things that might not be covered or aren't covered, certain court order transfers, foreclosure, bankruptcy, or transfer between co-sellers and spouses, and sales of new homes are not covered by the act. Now, new home sales has its own disclosure form and requirements. Okay? So what does the act require? It requires the seller to provide the buyer a notification, okay, on the form developed by the real estate board, okay, and this form is now called an acknowledgement. What does that mean? Before, our duty was to tell the buyer you have the right to go to this site and check the seller's disclosures, which weren't really disclosures, right? And there was a separate form that we had to have them sign to acknowledge, etc. Well, now there is this language on the form, okay, on the disclosure form itself that says the buyer has been advised of the disclosures. So advised of. So you pretty much need to be able to go over these, in my opinion. Not be a lawyer, but make sure they understand what is covered and not covered. All right. But when they sign it, it is an acknowledgement that they have been advised, whether they have or not, of what the different parts of the disclosure law state. Now, in 2020, July 1st, there were 6 new disclosures added to the disclosure statement. There's 6 new disclosures. So there's like 14 or 15 total now, okay? So the first one that they added, lead pipes, bringing the drinking water into the house. These are things that are on the site that, buyer, you really should check this out. The seller's not telling you about it, okay? Lead pipes were added. Marine clay. Okay, if you don't know what marine clay that is, that's a gray, gooky looking stuff that when a lot of water gets into it, it moves and it can actually push a house off of a foundation. They also added EPA radon zones. They added a residential energy analysis. They moved defective drywall, what we used to call Chinese drywall. They have moved that from a 1-page disclosure form to, I'm not telling you I have, you need to check it out. So remember from in the past, there were 5 mandatory disclosures. Chinese drywall was one of them. It is no longer one of those. It's moved into this, I'm not telling you I have this, okay? And the condition of a dam impounding structure on the property have also been added as, I'm not telling you I have these, you need to find out on your own. Now, disclosures regarding stormwater detention facilities. That used to be one of the ones I'm not telling you I have. It has now been moved in to the mandatory affirmative disclosure obligations of the seller. If you're not familiar with that, if there's a big hole on the property and there's this concrete structure in the middle of it with a grate on the top, okay, then that is a stormwater detention facility. And the idea is all the water will run to that pond and the water has a chance to filter down through the ground and collect the impurities. Unless there's a whole lot of rain and too much water goes in the pond, then it would flow out. So that is now a new mandatory disclosure. Okay, and we'll discuss those here again in a minute or two. Any questions about that part so far? And this is paragraph 7 of your sales contract. Okay, it's all reflected there. So what are some of the disclosures that are required under the Act? Okay, in addition to advising the buyer on the statement disclosure, the Act also has what we call 5 affirmative disclosures. So when your buyer goes to that website, okay, maintained by the state of Virginia maintains the website. They will see all the, I'm not telling you I have these, but they will also see the 5 affirmative. If your seller has actual knowledge of one of these 5, there is an additional 1-page disclosure form for each one of these that would have to be given to the buyer in addition to the state required form that they maintain. All right. And the first one, military air installation. We do not have that requirement in this area, but if you were in another area of the state like Virginia Beach and the property is located in a noise zone or accident potential zone or both, there's a 1-page disclosure form for that. I was actually down in Tidewater area for a training session several years ago, and I kept hearing this rumbling noise, and I thought it was trucks out on 64. And at break, I went out, and it was not. It was the jets landing at Oceana right over top of the Board of Realtor building I was in. First thing came to my mind, that's the way it works, is I wonder if the agents in this area use that disclosure form. But that would be an example. The second one, pending building or zoning violation. Now, this was added to our statute a couple of years ago. If the seller has actual knowledge of a pending enforcement action pursuant to the Uniform Statewide Building Code that affect the safe, decent, sanitary living conditions of the property, which they have been notified in writing. Now, this is the key to it. Notified in writing, okay, by the local zoning ordinance or the local authorities, or then that's statewide, or any pending violation of the local zoning ordinance that the violator has not abated or remedied under the zoning ordinance within a time period set out in the written notice of violation from the locality or the established by a court of competent jurisdiction. So if your seller finished the basement without a permit, do they have to tell? Probably not, okay? Unless they have received a notice from the county that they did not get permits and they're in violation of the local zoning ordinance. So paragraph 20 of our sales contract covers this, okay? And I've had people come back and say, well, they didn't tell us about this. My buyer, what can my buyer do? Well, after they settle, nothing. But if you were to look at paragraph 20, if you have your sales contract package there, the last paragraph on page 7, seller will pay any special assessments, will comply with all orders or notices of violations of any county or local authority, condo unit owners association, homeowner, or POA. Unless there's an actual notice of violation, the buyer will be responsible for it after settlement. Now, you may remember we've discussed this in the past, but I've had several problems with this, calls on this, not me personally. And, you know, I advise my buyers, okay, to always go to the county website, Fairfax County, it's called FIDO, Fairfax Inspection Database Operations. You go to that website, okay, and you put in the property address, and it will show if there's been any work done to that property, and if it's been permitted, and if it's, if it was permitted work, and if it's been finalized. Okay. If the basement shows unfinished in the tax records, and it's obviously finished here, that you're standing in, when my buyer writes a contract, my advice to them is to say, look, let's ask the seller to provide the permits and the finals on this. And if they don't want to do that, then I get them to sign that other form we have called adverse consequences of my actions, where I advised them to do this and they did not do it. So anything that the way the county puts it, anything that could go boom requires a permit. So if there's any electric, plumbing, gas, water, anything like that being done, it requires a permit in the county. Okay. So if I finished my basement and all I did was put drywall up, that everything else was already there, it was all roughed in, everything was there, then I didn't need a permit. But if I'm finishing my basement out and there was like, the house says three bedroom, 1.5 bath, and obviously it's now basement's finished into another bathroom and finished into another bedroom, etc. Then they probably didn't have the permits if it doesn't show. So protect yourself, protect your buyers. Any questions about that? I have a quiet group today. The next one, it's a mandatory disclosure. Meth lab. If the property was used to manufacture methamphetamines, then, and the seller knows it, then the seller must disclose it unless it was cleaned up in accordance with health standard guidelines, which if I ask somebody, did you ever use this house to manufacture or distribute meth? And they tell me yes, I'm probably not taking the listing. I'm probably going to get out of there, because to me, it would be pretty dangerous property if any of that residue is left over. Okay. Stormwater management facility is the new one that was added. Chinese drywall was removed. So effective July 1, sellers with actual knowledge of any privately owned stormwater management facility located on their property must disclose the long-term maintenance and inspection requirements. Each one of these has a form that DPOR has made. They're available on NVAR's website or VAR's website. Now, there's also a form for first sale of a dwelling. Builders have to use that one. Unless you're representing a builder, you probably wouldn't even need that form. The other one that I call mandatory under this Property Disclosure Act, private septic tank operating permit waivers. Okay. So it states that any property owner who obtains a waiver from the locality to repair a failing on-site sewage system, okay, and they will allow you to stay in the property if you're going to repair your system as a seller, okay, shall disclose that to anybody that wants to buy that property if you haven't corrected the system and got it approved by the county, because the waiver, okay, is null and void when the property is transferred. So it only allows the owner that is in that property that's going to correct the system to stay there. Okay. If you sell the property, there's a one-page disclosure form that's saying basically you can't occupy this property until you correct the situation. Okay. And we ran into that a lot with these alternative septic systems that were installed when we had the building boom. Last go around of this, they allowed a lot of houses to be built with alternative systems to handle the demand, and the systems failed, and they allowed the people to stay in the house. And then they came along and said, well, we're not going to allow any more alternative systems. And the state stepped in and said, no, if it meets our state guidelines, state law trumps the local law. But it was still very expensive. You're probably talking $25,000, $30,000, $40,000 to put this new system in. So we have, when they go to the site, I'm not telling you, I think there's like 15 of those now. And we have the 5 that will show up under the affirmative. And that is the septic system waiver, stormwater management, meth lab, zoning violation, and military aircraft. Okay. Any questions about any of that? Okay. What are some of the additional requirements for disclosures in this sales contract? Lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards. This is not part of paragraph 7, needless to say. This is the lead-based paint, and it requires the federal law requires it before the buyer is obligated to under a contract to purchase a property constructed prior to 1978 must provide EPA approved information pamphlet. So you have to give them the pamphlet, and as an attachment to the contract, the disclosure and acknowledgement of information on lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards. There's a separate form at NVAR. Only use that if the property is built before 1978, which tells them they have the right to conduct a risk assessment or inspection of the property for the presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards, etc. There are some exempt categories, but you probably won't run into it. You know, dorm rooms, things like that. Now, the key to this: when must this lead-based paint disclosure form be signed? It must be signed before contract ratification. Okay, before contract ratification. If not, the buyer will have the right to get out of the contract, and you've got a problem on your hands. Please, please, all of our agents, never, ever have your buyer sign one of these forms blank and send with the contract, okay? Because that's a direct violation of the law. And it says they have to receive the answers by the seller. You don't want the seller filling it out and sending it back later, and answers that your buyer should have taken into consideration, like, yes, we do have lead-based paint. In all my time, I've only had 2 properties that had the lead-based paint that we knew of. I asked the seller, do you have any evidence of lead-based paint? He said, oh yeah, when they did the painting, they tested and I have it here. And I said, well, was it removed? They really didn't know. So we had to use the disclosure form and mark yes, and if you want to check it, fine. Then we had lead-based paint tests done under the home inspection contingency, which back at the time didn't say inspections, it just said inspection. So they actually found lead-based paint in 2 boards in the whole house. And then they backed out of the contract because of that. So we had to have a company that was licensed and bonded, because the owner can't just do this themselves. You have to have an EPA approved contractor do this to properly remove any lead-based paint. And seller was not happy, but it was the best solution, because then we could say it's been taken care of. Okay, so the owner can go to the county and file for the permits themselves, but the work needs to be done by a contractor. Okay, you don't want to be ingesting lead-based paint in any way, shape, or form. Okay. So we have the lead-based paint disclosure in our contract. I'm just basically telling you what the disclosure requirements for a seller in the contract are. We also have POA and Condo Act. If the property's under POA and condo, then the seller has to supply the documents. We've gone over that in the past, where it says, hey, I deliver what I receive and the clock starts ticking, or a notice that it doesn't, nothing's available, your clock started ticking. Okay. Defective drywall has been removed from the mandatory back into, I'm not telling you I have, check it out. And there's one other one called a tourism activity zone. Tourism activity zone. This one is a voluntary one. If the seller wants to tell people their property is located in this tourism zone, if I was a seller, I probably would do it. Somebody buying a house in the city of Alexandria and they have, parades and whatever, and a lot of tourists coming. Doesn't hurt to disclose it, but that was not a mandatory. Okay. So when should the seller give the instructions for provide the disclosures for the POA Act? Okay. All disclosures referenced has to be provided by the seller before contract ratification. So if we have the seller sign the lead-based paint disclosure, we have the seller sign the property disclosure, etc., then download it into Bright, make it a document. And when you get a contract in on your listing, if it's not included, then I would go back and say, get your buyers to sign this, send it over before I present it to the seller, because the seller should not sign a contract, should not ratify the contract until the forms are signed by the buyer. Okay, and the reason being, if the forms are given to the buyer after ratification, then that buyer still has 3 days after delivery of those documents to void their contract. Okay, if hand delivered, 5 if mailed, as settlement, it's over, etc. But if they don't receive these disclosures for lead-based paint and for property condition before ratification of the contract, then you still have a contingent contract. And this goes all the way up to settlement. Okay, so you don't want a buyer using that to get out of a contract on your listing in the future. Okay. Any questions about any of that? If you have a question, unmute yourself and I'll be glad to answer. Okay, so what are your duties and responsibilities under this? What are your duties and responsibilities for the acts? Well, when it comes to lead-based paint, you even have to sign the form for lead-based paint. Okay, so saying that you've gone over this. Now, our Property Disclosure Act here in Virginia says if the agent explains the rights and benefits to buyers and sellers under this act, they have no further liability under the act. So you really need to go over this form with them and discuss what it means, right? But our law does require, not under the Property Disclosure Act, but under our agency statute, it says that you have a duty to disclose known material adverse facts pertaining to the physical condition of the property, which are actually known by you. Okay, so physical condition of the property, remember, does not mean anything outside the property lines. Okay, it's boundaries in, nothing to do with roads, unless that road is actually going to take a piece of this property, etc. So even though a seller may not have to disclose something, okay, if you know it and it's a known material adverse fact, known, you know it, material, it's about the property itself. Adverse means that if the buyer knew, would they still buy that property or would they ask for a contingency? Okay. Example I give, the roof has been replaced 7 times. Been repaired 7 times already this year. 7 times, not leaking right now. So is that something you would disclose as a listing agent? I might, simply because if it's leaked 7 times and hasn't been permanently fixed, so it won't leak anywhere else. If you were a buyer and you knew that fact, would you still purchase that property without maybe asking the owner to replace the whole roof, etc.? That's going to be your judgment call, but I can tell you, I would disclose something like that. Now, there's a couple of things that if you're representing a landlord, okay, licensees engaged by landlords with actual knowledge must disclose to prospective tenants the existence of any pipe or plumbing fixture, solder or flux that does not meet the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. Okay, so it's lead-free water for drinking, etc. Now, if you know, you have to disclose. If you don't know, then you can't disclose. But my first home in Arlington, back in 1969 when I bought it, the actual pipes bringing the drinking water into the house were lead. So we didn't know about any of that stuff back then, okay? Another question I often get, what about sex offenders? Do we have to tell about sex offenders? No, okay? What the statute says, we have the seller and the agent do not have any obligation to disclose information on sexual offenders beyond the buyer beware disclosure in the buyer broker agreement, etc., that says you need to check this out for yourself. It's also in our sales contract. Okay. Another one is polybutylene pipes. Okay. It's a plastic pipe, and it's had it known to leak. There's nothing in the law that requires a seller to disclose that they have polybutylene pipe. Okay. You need to make a judgment call whether or not it's a known material adverse fact to the physical structure of the property. I think if I took a listing that had it, I would be disclosing it to people. But you have to make that call. Okay. Not an easy one. I've heard differing opinions on it, but to me, that would still be a known material adverse fact to the physical structure of the property. Okay. I listed my son's home years ago. Now, this was a lot of years ago. A townhouse out in Manassas, and he had polybutylene, and we disclosed it. The other side wanted him to replace it, whatever. And we said no. You want the house? Here it is. We actually gave them references to websites, and the type of polybutylene in his house hadn't had any problems. It was a different manufacturer, but seller doesn't have to disclose it. Okay. Any questions about any of that? Well, if you have no other questions, then that's what I had for you for today. On Wednesday, we are going to start going through. We finished the contract and most of the forms for the contract. On Wednesday, I am going to start going through the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. We're going to go by line. Wednesday, remember, is back to basics. and that's NVAR Form K 1336. I want the exclusive right to sell, okay, not exclusive agency. If there's no questions, then I will see everyone here on Wednesday at 11 a.m. to start taking a look at the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. Have a good day.